Ohio's Huron River has always attracted people to its banks. Both Native Americans and Northern Europeans were drawn to its natural harbor and its 10 miles of navigable water upstream. One of the first white men to take advantage of the river's opportunities was John Baptiste Flemond, a French-Canadian trader and trapper who established a trading post just a few miles from the river's mouth. After the War of 1812, more and more settlers arrived from the east, eager to carve out new lives in the wild lands of Ohio. The Huron River's easily accessible harbor made Huron a natural Great Lakes port. But first, the town had to make some improvements to its harbor. The biggest problems were the sandbar that often formed across the mouth of the river, preventing boats from entering, and the shallowness of the river itself. In 1823, a group of Huron and Milan merchants formed the Huron Harbor Committee. In 1824, the village was platted, and soon after, a portion of the town was auctioned off to finance improvements to the harbor. In 1827, the federal government stepped in after private funds ran out. In the mid to late 1800s, railroads were looking for the most ideal locations to build railways and ports.
The ore docks in Huron were a typical railroad response in the 1870s and 80s to gain access to the growing iron ore and coal trade on the Great Lakes. Prior to that time, it had primarily been lumber and other commodities, but now iron ore was starting to assume rather gigantic proportions, so it was a lucrative business because ore used to be mined in Pennsylvania. Now it was coming from Michigan in the 1880s, then later in Minnesota in the 1890s, and it was becoming a very major commodity. So different railroads went to different harbors and built their own facilities. Almost every town that had a river going into Lake Erie wound up with an ore dock or two. So Huron was the choice of the wheeling in Lake Erie, which would get iron ore from Minnesota or Michigan, and they would haul it from Huron to southern Ohio, West Virginia, where all the steel mills were.
The railroad closed within 2 years because it could not attract regular traffic or financing for expansion. In 1880, railroad magnate Jay Gould invested in the Wheeling and Lake Erie with the intention of forming a transcontinental railroad system. Originally, the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad intended to have the railway line just pass through Huron and continue to Sandusky, but Sandusky residents refused to give the railroad the $20,000 it had requested as incentive to build the line. Huron, on the other hand, agreed to the Wheeling and Lake Erie's terms and leased the railroad public land on the east bank of the Huron River at the river's mouth. Huron then became the Wheeling's Lake Erie port. Work began on the docks, and what became known as Slip Number 1 was completed in 1882. The dock handled coal, iron ore from mines in Michigan, and lumber that arrived by ship and rail. The only equipment was the whirlies, small steam-driven cranes that could load or unload a ship. The whirlies ran up and down the east side of the new slip on rails so they could be spotted where needed. A small boiler mounted on a wooden cab worked a hoisting system that raised and lowered a tub. They were called whirlies because after the buckets were filled, they whirled around to be emptied. The dock workers filled and emptied the buckets by hand. The first ship to be loaded with coal was the sailing schooner Pelton. The first iron ore shipment arrived in Huron in 1883 on the schooner L.C. Butts. It took 16 men to unload 1,120 tons of ore in 3 days, using shovels and the whirlies. Each man was paid $6 for his work. Around 1888, it became apparent the Huron docks needed to be upgraded if they were to benefit from increased ore and coal traffic. The Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad finances were poor, so the Huron Dock Company agreed to operate the dock and install new ore and coal unloading equipment. The first improvement to the docks was the installation of a steam-powered shovel to load coal boats. The shovel was mounted on a pedestal and had a special bucket to scoop the coal out of the railroad car and dump it into the ship's cargo hold. This was an improvement over the whirly buckets, which had to be loaded by hand. The next improvement was the installation in 1894 of 4 McMyler bridge tramways on the north side of the slip for unloading ore boats. The ore bridges had a capacity of 300 tons per hour, compared to 30 tons for a whirly. The McMylers worked by having a bucket carried forward into the apron by cables and dropped into the hold. After it was filled, the buckets were hoisted back onto the bridge and either dumped into cars or onto a storage pile. In the early days, the buckets were filled by hand. The machines were rebuilt to use self-filling buckets in 1906. The bridge tramway revolutionized bulk materials handling, but the whirlies remained in service for many years. In 1896, the coal dock was relocated to the south side of the slip. In addition, the federal government extended the West Pier another 973 feet and built a new East Pier. In the early 1900s, the lake vessels were getting larger and needed more water and room to turn around when emptied. The ships had to be towed by tugboats out into the lake, and the river wasn't deep enough for the larger boats. They often ran aground, as the George Presley did just off Lakefront Park on the north side of Huron bordering Lake Erie. The bigger ships started shying away from Huron as word of the harbor's problems spread. The docks needed to be updated to stay competitive. In 1906, the Army Corps of Engineers widened the harbor from 120 to 180 feet and extended the west breakwall. And in the same year, the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad announced it would spend $1 million on dock improvements, including the construction of a second slip for both ore and coal, the construction of a 1,000 railroad car capacity yard south of the new slip, the construction of 4 steam-powered ore unloaders called fast plants on slip number 2. They could unload a boat's cargo directly into railroad cars. The installation of a steam-powered traveling ore bridge behind the fast plants to pick up ore for loading into the railroad cars and for transportation to the new storage yard, which was built between the 2 slips. It could store 600,000 tons of ore. The construction of a new McMyler car dumper and coal dock complex opposite the fast plants. The fast plants worked similar to the McMylers. They could unload a boat directly into railroad cars, but not onto the storage piles. They did not extend over the storage yards, but rather dumped ore behind the machines so it could be picked up by a traveling ore bridge. A new slip and turning basin was built on 200 acres of marshland upriver from slip number 1. This meant that Berlin Road, the main east-west road in Huron, had to be moved. The crossing was located on the south end of the Wheeling yards and was blocking the expansion of the turning basin and shipping channel. A new bridge was built over the river in 1914. The first men to work on the docks were Hungarian immigrants who came to the United States in the 1880s and 1890s to escape political turmoil and high taxes in Hungary. They were soon followed by the Italians in the 1890s and early 1900s. They came to America because of disease, starvation, and economic crisis in Italy.
There was a manpower shortage. I mean, Huron was probably less than 2,000 people at that time. And so they had to get somebody to work in these on the dock. It was hard work. A lot of the people here were farmers, or businessmen with stores. So somehow, and I'm not exactly sure about this, but somehow, either through word of mouth of people from Italy and Hungary that already had friends that were here, heard about it, and they ventured. And there were 3 areas from Italy. One of them was Alvito. That's where most of them were from, and that's where my father was from. There's another town called Creci, which is close to there, and that's where the Miolas and the Caterys, Jabels came from. And there was Calabria, and the families that came from Calabria were the Laritzes, Joffreys, Pissanos. And so anyway, these people came here. They rustled up enough money, got a ride to Naples and came across on a boat. Ellis Island, got on a train and ended up here. And they had friends that were already here, so they were able to stay at the board there. And they showed up one day on the dock. They gave their name and started working. Something interesting about that, in Huron there are Maciosis, a couple families, and none of us are related, and they're Majoys. And Maciosi Majoi, that's the same name in Italy. It's pronounced Macioce. But when they came here, the dock superintendent said, "What's your name?" And he mumbled something out. It sounded. He said, "Well, I'll call you Majoy," and he wrote M-A-J-O-Y down. And so that family name went on. But anyway, these people came here, and it was really tough at first because they had to find suitable housing. Their families weren't here, and so as time went on, they went back and got their wives or got married and came back, brought their families here, and some of them finally got their own houses. And on it went, it came here, the Wargos and the Molnars, et cetera. And so they're about 50-50, and they got along great. There were some problems when they first came here, and the language is one of them. I mean, that was a big problem. They spoke no English at all, but the Hungarians and the Italians were able to communicate quicker than the Americans, or than the Italians and the Hungarians with the Americans. English was a tough language for them, but they managed, and they began having children, and on it went. There were, I think, if you were to count, I was just making a head count here, that if you look at the original group, the first generation mentioned earlier, there was about 50 or 60 total. And then the second generation and the third generation, Catholics or Italians are very prolific at raising large families. And so the families grew. And I was born in 1933, right at the end of during the Depression. And times were really rough here. Then, as because of the Depression, but they managed. But one of the problems they had, in addition, was that they got paid and worked only during the summer, and so they had winters where they had no income coming in. But to show you how conscientious they were about with the business operators here in town, I remember Andrew Smith, who owned a grocery store, was telling me that he put these people on credit during the winter, and he says he never ever had anybody stiff him during that period, which I thought was great. They couldn't speak English, and like it is with a lot of people, if you don't know somebody or know about them, you begin to worry about them. And there was a fear that here was this group of foreigners coming over from Europe, and the other thing was that the fact that they settled in that East Side area, which is primarily Tiffin Avenue and Berlin Road, so they're all in one area, and there was concern. I mean, the mothers didn't want their daughters to to date the Italian men, the second generation men. They were all handsome, by the way, as Italians usually are. But that was a problem, and it disappeared to some extent. But even today, there's just a little residual feeling about that, and but that seems to be gone. It was an area where there were a few houses, and I think the company, the Cleveland Stevedore, I think they anticipated, bringing in outside workers, and I think they built some homes there. There's about 4 or 5 of them that still exist that were used as boarding houses. But it was available. It was close to the dock. It was adjacent to the dock, and there were some houses there that provided that could be, put up some of the people, and it stayed like a close-knit area. I mean, growing up, there were a lot of kids. One of the things I really enjoyed about that period was there were so many kids my own age. We had the lake on the north. We had the fields in the east that separated us from the dock. So that was all available to us for doing anything we wanted to do. We had the and with so many, we always had enough kids close to the same age to have football teams and baseball, and it was a great place to be growing up. One of the problems was, though, that Italians, even today, everybody has a garden. And back then, because of the Depression, they had not only gardens, but they raised chickens, and they had a couple of cows. And it was that rustic, that area, at that time they could do it, because big fields to the north and to the west of the area. Old Homestead was practically nothing there at the time. And so it was kind of like a little colony, and the locals, people had to go up to walk to town. There weren't many cars at that time, and get the groceries they would need to feed their families. And the thing about that, at Huron at that time, it just boggles my mind when you think about it, was less than 2,000 people. There were 3 grocery stores here. There were 3 auto dealers, several restaurants, at least 3 restaurants, 2 hardware stores. I mean, two drugstores. It went on, and now you look there and there's a boat basin, so everything they needed was within a walking distance away, and they became friends with the local dealers, the Thomas Market, and they began to fit in. But still, there was that little prejudice with some of the people. Okay, my dad was 15 at the time. My grandfather had owned a store for a while in England, an ice cream store, Gelati. My dad was born there in England. And then later, the times were rough at this period, and my grandfather decided to come here. But he went to work for the Ford Company, and he brought my dad with him. And in those days, the oldest son, he worked, gave his check to his dad gave him an allowance. And that's the way it was. When my grandfather saved his money, he was very frugal. He worked here about maybe 10 years, 8 or 10 years, away from his wife for 8 or 10 years. Collected enough money to go back, but my father decided not to go back. He'd met my mother and decided this is where he wanted to be. So he, in effect, against his father's will, he stayed here. And my mom was born here in Huron, and so he moved here then after they got married. They met in Detroit, and so he was born in Italy. She was born here. I remember them going to work. The dock was everything to this group. I mean, it was their source of income. And I remember the men walking to work from their homes, carrying their lunch pails. And there weren't a lot of cars back then. And if they had them, they certainly weren't used to drive down that hill to the dock. So they'd be walking from all directions across these fields there behind, and they'd come home at lunchtime if there was no boat in. And if there was a boat in, they'd come home sometimes just dead tired, having worked 12, 14 hours in a row, completely covered with iron ore. My dad would come in, he'd go down to the basement of the house, take these clothes off, set them aside. My mother would wash them later. He'd take a shower and sleep for like an hour, put clean clothes on, go back to work and work another 12 hours. And because then as the boats came, they had to be unloaded. And when they got really busy, they would have like a double shift. But for the most part, they didn't. These men were just on call. And there were long periods of, waiting there at that building for a boat to come in. And you'd see boats that were already anchored out past the lighthouse waiting for another boat to be emptied. And on it went. But there were some of the customs, some of the old people that were still there maintained some of the customs. Christmas time, every family visited every other family. And you never brought anything when you went to visit, but you went, and my grandmother then would serve these special little Christmas things that she had prepared. And so then I would go with my grandmother, and you can tell by my size that I liked food, and I get to sample all these different things through the neighborhood. Church was a big thing. You see I remember as a young man watching the ladies. As time went on, I became older, maybe like 10, 12 years old. Some of the original people were dying off, and they were widows. And the Italian women at that time, from the day that the person passed away, wore black. I mean, black everything. Black hose, black scarves, and they would walk to church every morning up the hill and go to St. Peter's. And I was an altar boy. And one of my friends and I were hired by the local priest to do some cleanup work in the sweep out the church. Anyway, we were up in the choir one day cleaning up, and these ladies had come up waiting for the next mass to start. And one of my friends would look over the railing and would say, Mrs. Temper, this is Jesus speaking. And he got a tongue lashing from the priest when they complained to the priest about that. That was, the other thing, the point I should make, I'll end with, is that when these families came here, their main purpose was they wanted their families to succeed as Americans. They gave up their nationality. The war came. Their sons went off to fight in the war. Some were killed. And when it's all said and done, if you from that second generation, there were lawyers, a mayor, a school principal, nurses, engineers. There were several people, which was what made those original settlers, very, very proud of the way it turned out.
In the 1800s, schooners were the main cargo vessels of the Great Lakes, linking the growing towns of the Midwest with the East Coast. They carried lumber, wheat, coal, iron ore, and even Christmas trees.
The vessels carrying iron ore on the Great Lakes evolved over time. Initially, it was small schooners and even passenger boats initially. Sometimes the initial cargoes back in the 1850s were carried in barrels. They weren't big quantities. Well, as it grew in quantity, the passenger boats couldn't start carrying a lot of iron ore on deck or any of that stuff, so they had the old wood schooners.
One of the largest schooners to sail the Great Lakes was built just a few miles up the Huron River at Freeze Landing by Valentine Freeze. At 287 feet long and with a carrying capacity of 3,100 gross tons, the Golden Age was a huge oak-hulled, four-masted schooner that was completed in 1883. She sailed the Great Lakes for 41 years, the last of which as the barge Pringle out of Detroit. She was sunk as part of a breakwater near Put-in Bay, Ohio, in 1924. Another schooner built by Valentine Freeze was the Charles C. Foster. She was one of about 40 vessels chartered in 1898 by Atlantic Transportation Company of New York to engage in the coal trade on the Atlantic coast between Norfolk, Virginia, and New England ports. The boats were no longer needed when the coal market collapsed after the end of the Spanish-American War in 1899. Some of the fleet returned to the Great Lakes, including the Charles C. Foster. Her life as a Great Lakes cargo boat lasted just 6 months, from June to December of 1900. She was being towed by the steamer Iron Duke with a cargo of iron ore when she sank in a storm off Presque Isle near Erie, Pennsylvania. 8 lives were lost when she sank. A month later, the Foster was found 80 to 100 feet under Lake Erie.
Now, a steam barge was built of wood, and it was literally an extrapolation of the barges you would find on the old Erie Canal or the Ohio and Miami Canal. They were one long hull with a small cabin at each end and a big center hold, which was filled with the bulk commodity. Well, that's what they did on the Great Lakes, but they modified it so that one end had a pointed bow and a pilot house, and the stern end had an engine and propeller. Otherwise, they were similar to the canal boats, which were pulled by mules. But they got to be 300-400 feet long, and they grew and grew. Again, you reach the size, though, that they couldn't build them any longer because the wood needed to be strengthened. They had steel arches in them, sometimes steel framing, but gradually they went to iron. And they built the Onoko about 1882, which was the first iron boat.
In 1884, the Chauncey Hurlbut, a wooden steam barge built in 1873, brought the second load of ore cargo to the Huron docks. Dock workers unloaded 1,195 tons of iron ore and then reloaded her with coal. The 185-foot-long steam-powered bulk freighter was constructed of wood. The pilot house was located forward with the engine room aft and the cargo hold in between. The Chauncey Hurlbut sailed the waters of the Great Lakes for 30 years before she was lost in a storm off Vermilion in 1908.
Iron was good. They built a few of those boats, but then they found out iron was brittle. So they went to steel, and that became the standard. It was still the steam barge concept, but they started calling them boats again. And they grew in size. By 1900, they were 400 feet. By 1905, maybe 500 feet. By 1910, 600 feet. But they were all the same standard design with a pilot house forward, a large open cargo hold, and the propulsion equipment in the stern. And things didn't change for a long time. It wasn't until the 1970s that the self-unloaders came in.
In 1888, a new type of vessel appeared known as the whaleback. The whalebacks, which were built as steamships and barges, had a unique design. Built of steel, they were round in cross-section like a length of pipe. The hull continuously curved above the waterline from vertical to horizontal, leaving, when fully loaded, only the rounded portion of the hull with its whaleback above the waterline. With sides curved in towards the ends, it had a spoon bow and a very convex upper deck. The vessels were normally operated in fleets, with one steamer towing one or more barges. Whalebacks were some of the earliest boats to haul iron ore to Huron. In 1913 and 1914, the Huron ore dock underwent a huge transformation with the addition of 2 Hewletts. Designed by Ohio native George Hewlett, the revolutionary machines were being used on docks throughout the Great Lakes. The Hewletts consisted of a large walking beam mounted on a carriage that moved laterally across the docks. It was mounted on a huge traveling base that moved up and down the docks on rail and could be positioned over any hatch on a boat. A self-loading clamshell bucket was attached to the base of a vertical leg fastened to the outboard end of the walking beam. The operator rode in the leg and controlled the movement of the machine. When the bucket was full, the operator would close the bucket and dumped the ore into a hopper over a Larry car mounted on a traveling base. The Larry car weighed the ore, then dumped it. Most Hewletts operating on the Great Lakes were electric-powered. Because Huron's light plant could not generate enough electricity to power electric Hewletts, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie did not want to build their own power station, the railroad installed steam-powered Hewletts, which were called water dogs. They were the last steam-powered rigs to be installed on the Great Lakes.
The Hewlett was revolutionary in that it was able to load its own bucket, which up till that time had not really been a practical alternative. Iron ore is so dense and heavy that you just can't use an ordinary clamshell bucket. The bucket would literally bounce off the ore pile. So the Hewlett had enough mass and weight that it was able to penetrate the ore pile, and it had a scraping motion which would gather the ore into the bucket, so it was self-filling. And if you read some of the initial reports about it, it was always referred to as a self-loading machine. Well, they would be able to fill the bucket, it would load into a rail car, go back, and the cycle time was such that they could do 300 tons an hour. Now this compared to men shoveling that could do 2 tons an hour per man. So it was a tremendous step forward, but it also substantially reduced the amount of manpower required to unload a vessel. Because for a while there, the ore trade was growing so fast that they were running out of places to build docks because it was so slow to unload a boat. It'd take 3, 4, 5 days to unload some of the bigger boats by hand. Well, the Hewlett was able to do it in a matter of hours. So Hewletts became popular at a lot of the railroad docks. The Hewlett was designed by George Hewlett, who was from Conneaut, Ohio, my hometown, who designed the initial machines in the late 1890s. First one was built in Conneaut, Ohio, on the ore docks that were operated by Andrew Carnegie. Legend has it that Hewlett was told he could put the machine up or assemble it at his own expense, and if it didn't work, he had to scrap it at his own expense. So it was a gamble. The machine itself was actually manufactured by a company called Webster, Camp and Lane that was out of Akron, Ohio. They built the machine in Conneaut, and it was an instant success. You went from having maybe 120 guys working on a vessel and unloading it in 2-3 days to unloading it in 4 hours with maybe 20 people, because you eliminated a lot of the manpower loading the buckets by hand. You still needed people in the cargo hold to clean up and bring ore in from the corners and things like that, but the Hewlett just was revolutionary.
In 1937, the docks were improved by installing a new electric car dumper on the north side of slip number 1. It was the most modern coal dumper on the Great Lakes at the time, with a capacity of 50 70-ton cars per hour. Loading the cargo holds with coal was a precise operation. The cars were first moved from the loading yard to the coal dumper. Each car was moved by gravity and had a brakeman who worked the handbrake wheel to control its speed. A pig ran between the tracks and pushed the car up the hill into the hoist mechanism. The coal would fall into a funnel which directed it into a chute leading into the vessel's hold. The chute on the dumper could be moved to place coal into any part of the cargo hold. This enabled the men to trim the boat and fill the hold to the maximum. Because coal is relatively light for the volume it occupies, a boat hold could be completely filled. When a car was emptied, it was put back on the track and rolled down away from the dumper, up the kickback. Gravity and the skill of the brakeman who rode the hopper reversed the empty car's direction on the kickback and rolled through a switch into the yard for empty hoppers. This was dangerous work. The brakeman had to slow the car by hand to prevent it from crashing into a string of empty hoppers. A new addition to the docks came in 1941 when the Eastern State Farmers Exchange began erecting a grain elevator where the first coal unloader was located. Construction was stopped during the war and was completed in 1952. The mill, which produced livestock feeds, employed 300 workers by 1956. The future looked very promising for the ore docks in the late 40s and early 50s. In 1949, the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway was leased to the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, which was known as the Nickel Plate Road. In 1950, the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway invested in a pair of electric Hewletts for $1 million apiece to replace the steam-powered Hewletts or water dogs.
And the reason that I started there is because they needed an electrician. And the reason they needed an electrician, because they brought some new Hewletts in there that were run by electricity. Those two big rigs were all electric, and it was my responsibility to make sure that those were running properly at all times. And if we did have any problems with them while we were unloading, it was my job to get up on that rig, locate the problem, and get it going immediately. They did not want any lost time. There was a lot of pressure with that job simply when the boat was there, because we didn't want to lose any time because of any malfunction on the rigs. We picked up the electric from hot rails that were running alongside of the tramway that the rigs ran on. And of course, that was high voltage. That was 480 three-phase. And there were shoes that slid along on those rails that picked up the electric. And sometimes those could get bad or get dirty or something and lose some of the current. But up in the rigs, we had what we called big synchronous motors up there that were run from 480 three-phase voltage. And those synchronous motors were running DC generators. The rigs were run all by DC current. Even though we picked it up on AC, we were running them all on DC, and the reason that we ran them on DC is because the ease of control. With DC motors, you could just barely budge the rig, or you could make it run faster, whatever. But at any rate, but those kind of things then there were relays, there were limit switches all over the place. When these rigs would go back and forth, if the operator wasn't watching closely, we had limit switches that when the rigs would go back and forth, we had limit switches that would slow them down, stop them. They were kind of backups for the operator. Those things could go bad. And of course, and then a lot of the relays and instruments on the boards, you never knew, because with the dust from the pellet ore and everything. But after as many years as I was there, when a rig stopped, you could almost go up and put your finger right on the problem. If they'd cough, you'd know almost what they were coughing about. One safety issue was this, that when an electrician is working on something like that with that high a voltage, we didn't necessarily always have to work it hot, but if we did, you always had to have another electrician. So the ore dock always had two electricians. I always had an electrician with me whenever we were working, and that was one of the safety features, if not a big help as well. And of course, we had to wear certain kind of shoes. We wore shoes that had no nails in them. They were kind of an insulating shoe. We bought them special so that when we were working on steel, and trying to touch something electric, we made sure that we didn't get shocked or get killed by electrocution. When we would get a boat in, I would go up on the rigs and get everything working, get everything turned on and get it ready. Then I would okay to the operator, the rig is ready to move. Then they would go ahead and get to operating. But if, while they were working, if something that wasn't working just right, we would want them to notify us immediately. The way they would notify us, they would blow a horn, 2 longs and 2 shorts, and then we would get up on the rigs and ask the operator, well, how's it acting? And as soon as they'd tell us, then we would go look for that trouble and keep the equipment going. I saw one man get killed. He was standing on actually looking towards the north, and they were pushing cars in from the south, and he was an elderly man. He did not hear the trains coming, and the cars pushed right into him and killed him. That was an unfortunate situation, and that even happened back in 1950, shortly after the rigs were running, and I was comparatively new at the time, and that bothered me to quite a little bit because I wasn't used to accidents happening like that. And then we did have over at the coal dock, we had a man over there. He was working. He'd been working all day and on our boat, and then we had just one shift, and we went over to the coal dock then and loaded a boat over there after unloading the ore boat the day before without any break. And while we were loading the coal boat, we had a man slip underneath the car and lost his leg, which was very unfortunate. To me, it was a good job, and by that I mean we worked long hours. We got a lot of overtime in. There was no such thing as a set time, because we could be called out any hour of the day or night. Whenever the boat came in, we would be there to unload it and be there, of course, until it was unloaded. The men accepted me. There was a set group of men that had been working there for years, and I was kind of an outsider when I went to work there. And when I went to work there, they accepted me right away, and I became a good friend of theirs, and they're still good friends of mine.
The Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway purchased 2 30-ton electric pushers called mules, used to spot cars under the Hewletts. They replaced steam locomotives that had been previously used for this job. Pushers picked up the empty cars at the north side of the dock, spotted them for loading, and pushed the full cars to the south end of the dock, where a yard engine picked them up and hauled them to the South Huron yard, where the loaded cars were shipped to the steel mills in southeastern Ohio and West Virginia. There were a number of boats stopping off at Huron during this time. Watching the impressive vessels dock and unload or load cargoes was a much anticipated event for many Huronites. Boats from the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company came to Huron often because of the company's contracts to carry Wheeling-Pittsburgh iron ore. One of the more notable ships to visit Huron was Cliffs Victory, a former Victory ship. Victory ships were a type of cargo ship produced in large numbers by North American shipyards during World War II to replace ships sunk by German Marines. Based on an earlier design, the Liberty ship, the Victory ships were a major part of the Allied thrust in the Pacific during the last 18 months of World War II. They supported the great battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa and brought thousands of servicemen home again in Operation Magic Carpet. Shortly after the start of the Korean War in June 1950, the demand for iron ore skyrocketed. The Great Lakes fleet owners struggled to keep up with demands. Shipyards on both the American and Canadian side were backed up with orders for new ships. Several companies looked to former ocean vessels to help with the wartime demand for iron ore. On December 10, 1950, the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company of Cleveland was the first shipping company to buy one of the World War II cargo boats when it bought the Notre Dame Victory from the U.S. Maritime Commission to convert into a lake freighter. Less than 6 months later, she began her new life as a bulk freighter under the name the Cliffs Victory. Her ability to reach 20 knots or 23 miles per hour to outrun German torpedoes served her well on the Great Lakes, where for a time she became one of the fastest ships on the lakes. She was laid up for the last time in 1981. Efforts were made to sell her as a marine museum at Toledo, but were unsuccessful. And in 1985, with scrap prices soaring, the Cliffs Victory was sold to High International Corporation of New York for $235,000. She soon sailed to South Korea under the name Savik, where she was dismantled for scrap in 1987. Another regular visitor was the Joseph H. Thompson, which came to Huron about 40 times a year. She arrived every 5.5 days with about 20,500 tons of ore. The 2 electric Hewletts could unload her in 11 hours. It took another hour to wind or turn the ship around. She was originally built by Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock in Chester, Pennsylvania, in early 1944 as the 515-foot cargo vessel Marine Robin for the U.S. Maritime Commission during World War II. As the Marine Robin, the Thompson made cross-Atlantic voyages for the war effort and was one of the supply boats at the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. After the war, the Marine Robin and her other cargo sisters were put into mothball fleets all along the East Coast. Like the Victory ships, some of the C-4 cargo boats were purchased by U.S. and Canadian iron ore companies during the Korean War. After her conversion in 1952, the Marine Robin was rechristened the Joseph H. Thompson. She was the largest freighter on the Great Lakes at 714 feet, 3 inches long. She plied the Great Lakes until 1981, when the bottom dropped out of the iron ore market. After a few years of sitting idle, a Michigan towing company bought the Thompson and turned her into a self-unloading barge, a job she continues today. The Arthur M. Anderson was another familiar visitor to the Huron docks. She was constructed in Lorain, Ohio, by the American Shipbuilding Company and launched on February 16, 1952. The Arthur M. Anderson is most famous for the last ship to be in contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald before she sank on November 10, 1975, in Lake Superior. The Anderson was the first rescue ship to reach the Fitzgerald after it sank in a futile attempt to rescue any survivors. The Edmund Fitzgerald also delivered iron ore to Huron. From the 1950s to the early 1980s, the docks continued to be a strong economic force in Huron. The jobs on the docks were often passed down from father to son, and despite the erratic hours, the pay was good. The men were on call 24 hours, 7 days a week. It could take 11 to 12 hours to unload a boat.
My brother, my father, my uncle had all worked there, and I knew Mr. Sprinkle, and I said, if you get an opening, let me know. It just so happened July of 1973, Harry Stotts retired Frank Wassley had a heart attack and died, and they needed somebody. They said, get to the hospital and get an x-ray or a back, because they worry about your back. Took the x-ray and they put me to work. Well, the machine up on top had 4 rails, and this unit up on top weighed, I think they said 250 ton. Had a huge hoist motor on the back end with 4 wires on it. They were all 1.5 inches. And these would bring the machine up and down. Well, the operator in there had a control which would trolley him out. The next troll could take him down. Then he had a lever to open and close the bucket. These were all run by, other than the trolley in and out, were all run by cables. Cables went right up through the leg to go down there, and this bucket would be 22 foot open. Drop it right into the pile, whether it was ore or pellets, close it up, come on up, and that dumped into a big round hopper. 55 seconds, that's all, and then they would come out. These guys were good at it. Joe Mina would run that thing, and he'd have it that close to the hatch combing, and nobody ever hit it. Nobody ever hit it. My cousin Ralph Pisano Jr. did one time, but he was messing around. They would bring this up, there was a hopper up above, and they would dump into this hopper. It would probably hold about 50, 60 ton. The Larry man had a list of the cars with the numbers and the gross weight that they could haul. In these cars, he would make out a ticket. Normally in a railroad car, he'd make 3 dumps in it. He'd put about, if it was an 80,000 maximum load, he'd put about 50 in, or no, they had more than 200 tons, excuse me. You'd put about 60 in one end, or 80 in one end. Then the guy running the pusher down below would move the car. You put about 80 in the other end and then put it in the middle. They had a pusher man that would spot this car and he would dump it. You had a scale in there to weigh it. But it would take approximately 3 dumps in almost all cars. The cars, well, they sent them to various places. They went to McDonald's up at Youngstown. A lot of it went to Steubenville, Wheeling, Pittsburgh Steel down there. That's where the biggest share of it went. Once in a while you would get something or go down to Ashland, Kentucky, do Armco. They would have, you had 4 operators, you had 2 electricians, you had 2 oilers, you had 4 Larry men, you had 4 pusher men, and 4 laborers. So it totaled up about 30 most of the time, and car checkers. The son of a gun, Joe Solardi, George Chapman, I'd be welding on a bucket. You try to weld it so it don't leak, because if I didn't keep the bucket closed up, Tony Tate would get on me. He had to clean the deck, see. So I'd be welding on it, and them guys would sit there and peck these pellets at you. So one day I went in and I asked Bob Engel, I says, doesn't the locker room need cleaning out? He says, yeah, probably, boss. I said, close your door. Well, I took an 1.5 inch fire hose, and Ralph Pisano Jr. opened the valve, and I washed Joe Solardi right out the door.
Unfortunately, in 1958, coal shipments began a gradual decline. On October 16, 1964, the Nickel Plate Railroad merged with the Norfolk and Western Railroad and the Wabash Railroad. As a part of the merger agreement, the N&W bought the Pennsylvania Railroad's line from Columbus to Sandusky, which included Sandusky's coal docks. Because coal shipments had been declining in Huron, they shut down the docks and sent all coal shipments to Sandusky. The J.E. Upson brought the final shipment of coal to Huron in November 1964. The car dumper crew was laid off. Those with enough seniority went to work on the ore dock, which meant layoffs for those with less time on the docks. Although the coal docks ceased operation, in 1966 the north end of the docks found new life with the construction of the Huron lime plant. Still in operation today, the lime plant receives shiploads of limestone that it converts into hydrated lime for steel making. By 1971, the Eastern States Farmers Exchange was owned by the Pillsbury Corporation, which used the 20-acre site as a Great Lakes and international grain shipping terminal. Business at the ore docks was strong through the 1970s. An all-time record was set in 1979 when 151 boats brought in 2,784,000 tons of ore. As higher-grade iron ore grew scarce, it was replaced by lower-grade taconite. Although most of the high-grade iron ore had been depleted from the mines in Minnesota, Michigan, and Canada, scientists in the 1940s developed an inexpensive method of extracting pure iron from taconite. Taconite is a flint-like type of rock containing low-grade iron ore. Vast reserves of taconite were discovered in Minnesota in 1870, but were considered worthless because extracting the pure iron from the mostly impure ore was extremely difficult and too costly. The Reserve Mining Company built a taconite processing plant at Silver Bay, Minnesota, where by the late 1950s they were producing 6 to 10 million tons of pellets a year. By 1982, the ore dock began receiving most of its taconite in self-unloading freighters. In that same year, 31 of 66 boats were self-unloaders. The Hewletts were becoming obsolete. In 1983, they were used 3 times, in 1984, 7 times, and in 1985, back down to 3 times. Even though the Hewletts were rarely used, the docks were still busy. In 1984, the docks received its largest single cargo ever, 38,108 tons of taconite in the freighter St. Clair.
It wasn't until the 1970s that the self-unloaders came in, where they put a conveyor belt under the cargo hold and a boom, and it unloaded itself. And that was kind of the end of the docks that used Hewletts and other shoreside equipment. The docks then just switched over to providing an open storage space and then loading it out of the pile into rail cars. You went from maybe 100 men on a Hewlett dock, say at Huron, to 1 or 2 people monitoring the unload, primarily telling the boat where to spot the cargo, and then maybe 4 people loading the rail train. So the manpower requirements were substantially less.
In 1985, the financial problems of the dock's largest shipper, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel in Steubenville, and the decline of the domestic steel mills caused the iron ore contract to be terminated. The dock could not find another contract for the 1986 season and was closed. The Hewletts and the coal dumper were dismantled in 1989.
But what's amazing is they were a factor in the iron ore industry from, say, 1900 to 1992. That's an enormous amount of time for a piece of equipment. You know, a lot of things, if it lasts 20 years, it's replaced by technology. Well, the Hewlett endured. You know, I mean, there were Hewletts in Chicago lasting into the 2000s that were being used to unload coal barges. So you're talking almost 110 years of life for the Hewlett unloader. That's really amazing.
After a nearly 10-year hiatus, the dock resumed service in 1994 when the Norfolk Southern Railroad leased the dock to the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway, a newly formed privately owned company. The Cooper T. Smith Stevedoring Company, one of the oldest and largest in the United States, was responsible for loading and unloading the ships. Shipments of taconite from mines in Minnesota are delivered to the Huron dock by Cleveland Cliff boats. A few men can unload the ore onto railroad cars in about 4 to 6 hours. The taconite is shipped by rail to steel mills in Steubenville, Ohio, and Wheeling, West Virginia. The ore and coal docks played an integral part in Huron's history. As the docks grew, the town's economy prospered. New jobs brought new families to the area, creating an increased demand for goods and services. For many, many years, the docks served as one of the driving forces behind Huron's continued growth and thriving economy. But when the coal docks ceased operation and the Hewletts were replaced with self-unloading ore ships, one of the most significant chapters in Huron's history came to an end as well. The docks have left a lasting legacy embodied in the descendants of the people who labored there and in the culture of the town itself. Today, the docks are in a state of transition. The Harvest States Mill ConAgra Foods facility closed in 2006 and was sold to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. ODNR's Division of Watercraft built a public boating and fishing access site with launch ramps, docks, and parking facilities in 2009. The City of Huron received grant money to raise the former grain silos and flour mill and is looking for private developers to rebuild the old ConAgra property, which is in the process of being demolished. Ideas include condominiums, recreational parks, restaurants, and retail development. City officials and residents are confident that the area will once again be a vital part of the community.